Welcome everyone to this webinar titled Building Economically Cohesive Communities in the Time of the Corona Pandemic. This webinar is organized jointly by EBBF, Ethical Business Building the Future, and the Wilmette Institute. And it's a pleasure for us to today have the privilege of listening and sharing with Jean Parker. Jean Parker is a qualitative researcher using participatory research to build cohesive communities throughout the world. Her doctoral dissertation was on emergency preparedness, learning through community radio in North Indian villages. Her book, entitled Emergency Preparedness Through Community Cohesion, an Integral Approach to Resilience, published by Routledge in 2019, applies principles of the Baha'i faith to community building, decision-making, and community-based economic enterprise as necessary components of resilience and sustainability. Her research interests include community-based economic sustainability, integral research and development, and the application of Baha'i process of consultation in participatory research. She teaches business and economics at the Wilmette Institute and nonprofit management at Regis University in Denver, Colorado, in the United States of America. She is also the producer and host of EBBF's podcast, Discovering How. So welcome, Jean. We'd like for you to share, take 20 to 30 minutes to share your key ideas on this presentation. And then we would like to invite the audience, people that are watching either on Facebook, on YouTube, or in the Zoom webinar, to ask their questions through the different chat tools on each one of those tools, on each one of those websites, enabling for better conversations after Jean has done her presentation. Welcome, Jean.
Thank you, Vahid, and welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. I want to begin by thanking the people at EBBF, the Wilmette Institute, the technical team, my goodness, they do such a great job, and also the learning team at the EBBF collaborating with the Wilmette Institute. I have been limited to 20 minutes for this presentation. I will do my best to stay in that period of time, but there are people, I believe, on the call who would like some additional explanation of the slides that we show, and so I invite you to stay after the webinar is finished, after the Q&A, and I'd be happy to go through the slides and explain more about them. Now, those in my classes who have taken classes with me at Wilmette and elsewhere know that I like action, and I like to give people motivation, the information and motivation to take action. I invite you now to take out your writing devices and prepare to take notes, because you will have, at the end of this, I hope, a very comprehensive list of things to do, because we all need more things to do. All religions have something to say about economics, and so I want to begin our study of that with the Baha'i writings. We have two quotations from the writings that I'd like to share. The next slide, please.
When the love of God is established, everything else will be realized. This is the true foundation of all economics. Reflect upon it. Endeavor to become the cause of the attraction of souls rather than to enforce minds. Manifest true economics to the people. Show what love is, what kindness is, what true severance is, and generosity. That's from Abdul Baha in the Promulgation of Universal Peace.
Thank you. And would you move to the next slide and read that quote as well?
The welfare of any segment of humanity is inextricably bound up with the welfare of the whole. Humanity's collective life suffers when any one group thinks of its own well-being in isolation from that of its neighbors, or pursues economic gain without regard for how the natural environment, which provides sustenance for all, is affected. A stubborn obstruction, then, stands in the way of meaningful social progress. Time and again, avarice and self-interest prevail at the expense of the common good. And this is by the Universal House of Justice, from March 2017.
Thank you. Everything I say from now on out is That's the foundation, what Vahid just read. That's the foundation for everything I say from now on. The Universal House of Justice, which is the supreme body of the Baha'i faith, also says that this social and economic disparity keeps the world on the brink of war and instability. War and instability. The coronavirus has amplified every disparity, instability, and vulnerability already present in society and introduced new ones, which are beyond the scope of this presentation, but we observe them around us every day. These disparities are not just about the virus, but they're about how the lockdowns were implemented by governments with no planning and no provision for the poor, people with disabilities, migrants, etc. The failure of institutional structures to respond adequately or productively to the virus has left most vulnerable people across the world to fend for themselves and to manage or not. To me, this era can be distilled by the struggle between me versus we and mine versus ours. And we're in a real contest right now about which one of those is going to prevail. In my view, we actually don't need social distancing. What we do need is physical distance and social cohesion. And would you move to the next slide, please? Terminology. So before we go any further, I want to define economics. I define economics as the creation and responsible management of resources, and that includes responsible distribution of resources. And I define prosperity as the well-being of humanity and the planet. That's it. The well-being of humanity and the planet. It's not about what kind of car you have or what kind of house you live in and all of that. The strategies for achieving economic cohesion in the time of Corona will be different for each community, but I have some concepts that I would like to share that I hope will be helpful. Next slide, please. We have here a big donut sort of thing on the screen. Kate Raworth, who in my book is the goddess of economics, she really is, you need to check her out. Her team developed the donut economics illustration, and its purpose is to illustrate a frame of reference for understanding planetary sustainability combined with social justice in an economic context. It provides a framework for policy planning and implementation of legislation and policies. And if the donut is not balanced correctly, it will disintegrate, as will society if its elements are not balanced correctly. So here's a question. How do we implement donut economics? There are two words that go a long way to implementation of a concept like this: mutualism and altruism. So we all know that we're being asked these days to wear masks when we go into public or when we're dealing with vulnerable people. Those masks don't actually give us a whole lot of benefit. They might give us some benefit, but they are actually for the people around us. They give benefit to the people around us. We're being asked to practice altruism by wearing those masks. The choices that are being made right now about practicing this type of altruism are unusually visible out in society. I'd like to just ask, how are we doing with that? I think it's a legitimate question that we can ask, how we're actually doing with that type of altruism. Mutualism is not charity. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Next slide. How do we practice things like mutualism and altruism? Here's a big list, and these slides will be available to people after the webinar and on the recording as well. I can also make them available. This is a list that comes from Badi Shams. It's a wonderful website, and it's full of resources on economics. Here's your first action step, is to set an example by living the life you want to see. And let me explain what I mean by that. If you're a long distance runner or a bike racer and you do things long distance, you know the idea of imagining yourself on the far side of a hill as you're climbing that hill. And so the idea of running through a hill, instead of thinking about the struggle that you're undergoing, instead of thinking about the struggle that you're having climbing the hill, thinking about yourself and imagining what it's like on the other side of the hill will give you a whole new perspective and help you to climb that hill more effectively. We don't deny reality, but we do look forward. And we can do that through language. So, for example, instead of saying, we're trying, we can say, we are doing. And instead of saying, well, we can say, we will. The much more definitive language and much more intentional language that we can use. To reach economic cohesion, we must call for justice. And would you move to the next slide, please?
Justice is in this day bewailing its plight, and equity groaneth beneath the yoke of oppression. The thick clouds of tyranny have darkened the face of the earth and enveloped the peoples. Baha'u'llah.
Thank you. Let's move to the next slide. Here's your second action step. Practice justice. Stand up for others. These are three of my favorite quotes by Martin Luther King. He reminds us, Dr. King reminds us what happens to our soul when we look aside, when we look the other way. And the end of the third quote is my favorite. He says, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. The silence of our friends. Stand up for others. Say their names. Say their names. Do business with companies that are committed not to pollute, and then tell them why. Work with companies that make sure that their apps and websites are fully accessible and inclusive and usable by everyone through inclusive design, and then tell them why you're doing business with them. That isn't charity, it's just good business. The ultimate mutualism is to stand up for others who are different than you are, even if you take the risk of negative consequences. Men need to stand up for the inclusion of women. You know, the world is missing the potential of women and girls. Gender inequality, according to the World Bank, costs the global economy $160.2 trillion each year. Stand up for women. It's no accident that some of the places that have had the best outcomes from the coronavirus are headed by women. I think that's worth standing up for. Next slide, please. So we have a pledge, and this is a challenge that was made by Owen Barter, who is the Europe director of the Global Center for Development. And in this pledge, he encourages male experts to commit not to appear on all male panels, or manels as he calls them. And so that is a commitment that he made, and he's encouraging other men to make that same commitment, standing up for others. Next slide, living systems. Cohesive communities have attributes of living systems, and they include things like the balance of interests amongst the parts, and that all the component parts are potentialized. Any system needs such attributes if it is to succeed. Otherwise, it has no chance of success. Next slide, please. Constructive resilience. Community economic cohesion can be reached by practicing constructive resilience. There's a description of it here on the slide. Again, I'm happy to go over that with people who want to stay after the webinar. Constructive resilience occurs when new institutional structures are created that attract people away from the oppressive ones, making them obsolete and disappear. Next slide, please. This is for those people who like theories and things to be drawn out. This is an illustration from my doctoral research of a community building process toward constructive resilience. To build cohesion, avoid false dichotomies and binary thinking. You've all heard the question, do we save lives? Do we save people's lives, or do we open the economy? Why is this an or? Either or statements do not reveal truth or the possibilities hiding underneath the surface. Here's your next action step. I hope you guys are writing these down. Practice hopefulness with ourselves and with others. So we know that hope is, it's necessary to integrate hope within a person to avoid that person's disintegration. But it's also necessary to do the same thing with a society, or it will destroy itself. A society without hope will destroy itself. We risk the compounded difficulties of our current circumstances leading us to abject despair, and we must resist it. We must resist it, and we must assist others also to resist it, or we're finished. So there are trends emerging that promote mutualism and altruism throughout the world, and we're going to have a look at a few of them right now. The next slide. This is the Baha'i Institute in Indore, India. These women are learning new agricultural practices, and they're going to take these skills back to their villages and share that knowledge with other people in their villages. Here's your next action step. I really hope you guys are writing these down. This is a multiple one. Educate yourself, share that knowledge, and then activate that knowledge together with others. Next slide, please. People in Colombia are resurrecting indigenous knowledge and skills to maximize agricultural production, bypassing, quote, expert or exploitive corporations that do not have their best interest in mind. Next slide. This is in Kenya. This is an example of community members in Kenya making knowledge about healthcare available to ordinary people. Next slide. Here in Mongolia, banking services are being made available to ordinary people along with economic literacy. So it's not just the service here that's being made available, it's the skills and the knowledge to participate in that service. Next slide. A lot of people have seen this website, GoFundMe, and similar platforms. These make it possible for direct giving to others and by ordinary people, bypassing funding structures that favor the elites or those with connections. Next slide. The Uber concept is being reapplied to manage medical and emergency transport in rural Tanzania. And the next slide about the repair cafes. Repair cafes facilitate items being repaired by volunteers instead of thrown out. So we have people who are volunteering to fix things rather than throw them out. Next slide. Tool libraries encourage people to share resources sustainably. And I understand now that the tool libraries are beginning to be integrated into public library systems. I think that's so cool, I can't even stand it. And I am wondering what other resources can be shared in this way that we will think of as a society. Slides, same cafe. This is one of my favorites because they have really good chocolate chip cookies. Okay, same stands for so all may eat. So all may eat. There are no cash registers in this place. You know, there are no price on the menu. People pay what they want to. It's all on the honor system, and people pay what they want to. The couple that started this cafe, they tried to get financing from a number bank applied to, said their business model, having people pay whatever they wanted to, was crazy and it would never work. And the banks would not back them. And so they raised money from their friends and families, and they used their savings to open the cafe. Time banking, where this has emerged as a strategy where people share time and exchange time instead of money. And the next slide, please. New Economy Coalition. The New Economy Coalition is a good resource to find out more and how you can get involved. Yes, I mean you, to get involved in building new economies. And we've all heard this, people say, and particularly corporations, a lot of times, all in this together. These people will be happy to lay a little reality on you about that statement, I'm sure. Now, typically, economic health is measured by using indices like GDP, gross domestic product, and other indices. And would you move to the next slide, please? Important links. Here are some examples of other indices that more accurately measure economic well-being. And they're indices like the Better Index, the Sustainable Economic Development Assessment, and I like this one, the Happy Planet Index. All religions have tenets that support kind of realignment. In Buddhism, there's a proverb. It says, if one lights a fire for others, it will also brighten one's own way. Service to others is in our higher nature. And move to the last slide, please. I want to end with the words of Abdul Baha. This is also your final action step. So you're going to do this. Here's what he has to say. Never lose thy trust in God. Be thou ever hopeful, for the bounties of God never cease to flow upon man. If viewed from one perspective, they seem to decrease, but from another, they are full and complete. Man is, under all conditions, immersed in a sea of God's things. Therefore, be thou not hopeless under any circumstances, but rather be firm in thy hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean, for sharing those very timely ideas and inspiring and stimulating thoughts, actually. I was very interested by hearing this idea of mutualism, which sounds a little bit abstract initially, but then you were sharing so many examples of actual action taking place on the ground that it shows that this can be done. And also, I think we all have a tendency to wait for the government, the UN, the large institutions to change. And what was striking in the example you were sharing was that actually this is the examples you were sharing are all happening at the grassroots level. So yes. I'm seeing knowledge being shared at the grassroots, good practices being shared at the grassroots level. and even resources being shared, which I find quite novel, actually.
Yes. Yeah, and that's the fun part. That's the fun part, is that in a lot of cases, and we all know, I think, where they are, the governments have actually in many ways been impediments to progress in this, and have really handled this whole situation very badly. There are exceptions to that, but so yeah, people are finally getting the idea that, look, this is about us. This isn't about following somebody else. But I would say that mismanagement of resources is all around us. And what I hear more now than I've ever heard before is that it needs to stop, and that the linkages between the emergence of the coronavirus and climate change, that we're living too close to animals, where we've taken over their habitats away from them, and that these crossover viruses are now going to occur. The linkage is being made much more than it was ever made before, and that's a good thing. I'm an intersectional thinker by nature, and so all of this joined up thinking is really important. No more can we afford to be restricted by discipline or to be restricted by niche topics. Yes, there's a place for those for specialization. We have to have those in order to have that kind of knowledge. But we have got to understand that it's the intersections, it's the way that things interact together that is where the answers really are. It's where the problems are, but it's also where the answers lie.
And while we're on the subject of mutualism, Christine asks, can you please comment on how mutualism supports more unity? How do you connect this idea of mutualism with unity?
So I look at it as a cycle, kind of. So when you have mutualism, unity is a natural outcome of it. And when you have unity, when you have true unity, mutualism is a natural outcome of that. And so they walk hand in hand. They're unified, you could say, concepts. They're also unifying concepts. And so you find that people who engage in mutualism, true mutualism, come to understand the concept and the advantages to working in unity automatically. It's kind of like, oh, why didn't we think of this before? Look at how our group has progressed. We've now progressed away from the issue we originally came together for, and we've now moved on to be to have much more solid foundations of interaction, friendship, and exchange.
Awesome. And another question that our friend Nabil asks is, what is the role of the individual in accelerating the movement from individualism to mutualism?
Right. So it's a process. And as individuals, we have the opportunity to set examples and experiment and set examples. And so in our interactions in groups every day, whether they're work groups or, housing groups, or wherever we're interacting with others, even inside families, we can do it in a way that promotes both mutual understanding and mutual action. And so it's not like we sit down and we say, oh, there's this cool thing called mutualism. Let's try that, right? We don't really do that. What we do instead is that we live the world that we want to see. So if we want to share knowledge about mutualism, we live mutualism, and then we tell people about it. And we tell people what it's like to live that way. But it's an experiment. It's trial and error. It's the same as when we talk about consultation and using consultation in workplaces. You'll make mistakes, and you know what? That's okay. You just try it again, do it again until it succeeds. Also, remember this: if you think you've made a mistake, it doesn't necessarily mean that you did make a mistake. All it means is that the particular process that you tried to use perhaps wasn't refined enough or thought through enough or something. But remember that along the way, you plant seeds with people. You plant seeds, and you don't know where and when that seed is going to sprout and become something really viable. And so yes, it can be discouraging, but it's also important to realize that idea of planting seeds for the future.
And actually, Jean, this connects to one of the questions we received early on, which was, how do you respond to the tension of focusing on internal self-work versus the need to react and to counteract against the old normal? So taking action versus work with, let's say, the larger community versus the personal transformation.
Yeah. So I think that they're simultaneous and they motivate each other. So doing really deep self-work, self-analysis, and work on individual internal matters can motivate action, and vice versa. Taking action also leads one into hopefully a reflective space to for self-examination. Here's the problem, though, is you can get stuck on either side of this equation. You've got to have a balance between the two. There are people who will spend years and years and years in self-reflection and not really take any concrete action in the outer world.
Right.
And that's a problem, that they get stuck there. Likewise, there are people who they take action, they go, and they never stop to reflect on what they're doing and why. So reflection is very important. The balance is different for everyone, and it's different at different times in people's lives.
I like that. And then that actually brings me back to the question, the slides you were showing about this idea of sharing resources and sharing knowledge in a very grassroots, local way. And my question was, what kind of resources, what kind of attitudes are the ones that will favorize or make more impactful this idea of sharing resources? What kind of attitudes do you think we need to work on most urgently?
Yeah. Well, one of them is realizing that there are certain things that we don't need, but that we need collectively. So in the example of the tool library, let's say, groups that put together a tool library, and often they're in neighborhoods too, so they're like localized groups of some kind. They come to the conclusion that, look, we don't all need an electric drill. We all don't need an axe for chopping wood. We don't all need those things. We can have one or two of those things for all of us. And we set up a system that facilitates the lending of those items to people who need them. There are also people who do this with cooking implements. There are people who think, well, I have this particular item, I don't know, maybe it's a mixer or a food processor or something like that. Maybe I use it once a week or once a month. Or maybe I use my baking pans more seldom than I used to. We don't all need those things. So let's get together a collection of those things and we can share them.
Awesome. And so that needs probably some build up in terms of sharing this idea that we will actually build this resource for everyone to benefit from.
Right. Yeah, so it's like a library. It's like a library. People, they get, I guess, a library card, and they put a deposit for the item that they're going to use. There's a checkout process and a return process. They set up policies and practices that meet their needs, and one of the things that I've noticed about things like tool libraries and repair cafes and things is that people really want to share their experiences. So the people who have started these things, right, and put these things together, they really want to tell others about it. So knowledge itself is also a shared resource, and they are happy to tell you how they did it.
Great. Elsie has a question regarding how communities can take steps. I'll read it to you. It says, what guidance do you have for communities that are newly sensitized to their shared fate, who have no experience or skills in organizing around resilience? There are many examples that you've shared and that are conceptually exciting. How do we get them to the last mile into specific communities? So, yeah.
Right. So people will come together around an issue that's of primary concern to them, and it's different for each community. It could be something really serious like air pollution, or that the government wants to build a highway between them and the rest of the city, that kind of thing. Or it could be something they get together and they say, doing this particular strategy would really improve our neighborhood, whatever it happens to be. The important thing is to start with what's achievable, and what is specific enough that it's measurable, and they can sit down in some time after doing it and say, well, how did we do with that? When they reflect on it, how did we do with that? What could we have done differently? Or what did we do that really worked? There's an acronym called SMART that kind of speaks to this, and I'm not sure I'm going to remember all of the letters of the acronym, but it's specific,
measurable.
Here we go. You guys that went to business school. Specific, measurable, achievable. What's the R? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't have the whole.
So, using attributes like that can help to shape a strategy that people want to see. It only takes one person to get things started, or one family to get things started. And by the way, these are things that kids really need to be involved in. The more that kids, when they're growing up, are involved in this kind of community activity and community building and cohesion, they'll just carry it into their adulthood. And so, I hear from kids all the time, oh, that's the way I grew up. I don't know any other way to be.
All right. And
right?
Gary,
that's living the world that we want to see.
Sorry. Yeah, Gary was just helping us with the acronym. It's specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-oriented.
There we go. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary.
I'm not the best at acronyms. Thank you. Yeah.
All right. So there's a question from Beverly, which asks, has this worked in poor Black neighborhoods in the U.S.?
Yes.
Do you have examples in mind? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. In fact, in neighborhoods and communities that have a lot of poverty and a lot of difficulties, they work the best. People are really committed to them because nothing else has worked. Nothing else has worked. The government isn't going to save you.
Right.
The corporation isn't going to save you. It really isn't. And it might do the opposite, So that's where they work the best, is where people don't have a lot of resources.
Yeah, and actually that connects to Charla's question from YouTube. She asks, when certain powers control the distribution of resources, how can the sharing become fair, even within a country?
Yeah, that's the question we're all asking. It doesn't have an easy answer. It's incremental. I find that moving forward on these things is a really incremental, step-by-step process. It's important to identify the resources that need to be shared. That would be the first step. And by doing that, to identify how those resources can be shared. And then you've got to eventually dialogue, of course, with the people who have those resources, understanding that power and resources are generally not given away voluntarily. There are exceptions to that, where people really do change their viewpoint enough where they say to themselves, what I've been doing is wrong, and I'm going to now stand in solidarity and share these resources. If I can just make an analogy, this isn't a resource analogy, but one of the things that we've noticed here we're in a particularly difficult situation here in the U.S. With the amount of police violence. There have been police chiefs and officers across the country who have stood in solidarity with the protesters. That's what it means to stand up for others despite negative consequences. And so what they've said is, I have something, but I don't want to have that something anymore because it's costing too much to someone else. And so there are circumstances where people do change from their power positions and do take on a more democratic, with a small d, way of living and become inclusive. In fact, there are really, really, really good examples of people who have done that.
And back to this question about personal transformation versus social transformation, you were mentioning that in personal transformation, the idea of reflection was very important. And I'm wondering, what do you think is the role of reflection for a community's transformation? How can we help a community achieve, let's say, a joint reflection, and where should that lead to?
Reflection it's really essential, and it's part of the process of action and consolidation and reflection. So we take action, and then we go back and we think about what have we done, and we sort of make sure that the foundations are underneath of what we've achieved, that it's going to be sustainable and last. And then we reflect on it. And we say it's the same process really for an individual as it is for a group, right? We say, what could we have done differently? What could we have improved? What worked really well? What can we do again? How can we expand this now to include additional people, or to be in more places, or to somehow expand what it is that we've done? So that isn't really possible to do in the midst of lots of activity, right? There's a lot going on, a lot of demands on one's time and energy and capacity and so forth. And so it's necessary to have a reflection part of the cycle to engage in that kind of deep thinking. And that ultimately leads to planning, which then leads to action, which then leads to consolidation, which then leads to reflection, which then leads to planning.
And there goes the cycle.
And there goes the cycle. There are more elements in the cycle too, but those are the main elements.
Great. Olive asks us, do you have suggestions for books or articles that expand on the role of access to different forms of resources to advance justice and equity within communities?
Oh man, too many to list. I would say that at this point, if you're interested in resources that are specific to our current times. The websites that are on the slide just before the ending slide, and again, we'll have these available. These are good places to start. And I say that because, when you publish a book, it's out there and it's done. And you really, unless you've got a website connected to it, as a lot of people do, there's not really a way to change it. I published my book a year ago, and I would absolutely revise it considerably were I to write it now. But so books are good for background conceptual information right now, but the current stuff is all on the internet. And so start with things like the New Economy Coalition. And there's a list of resources. I don't know if is it possible to put that slide up again, Daniel?
Sure, I will do now.
Okay. So all of those resources, and there are more. I mean, there are way too many to even go into. Every affinity group imaginable has websites now that are looking at how do we fix this economic disparity.
And so maybe that leads us to the next question. Do you think the examples from other countries that you showed in your presentation are applicable in the United States? Are there good examples that you can share from the United States?
Yes, they are. Yeah. Yeah, they exemplify what is being done in the United States. I purposely chose examples from many parts of the world in order to show that doing this is a global movement. It's a global message of the emergence of new trends in community economic cohesion. And so each country, each community has the task of adapting such examples to its own context. But once it's done that, then absolutely. And then of course you have to share it with others. You can't just do it, and leave it. You have to share it with others. What was it like? What was the experience like? What did you learn? What happened?
Yeah, and even the process of looking at a model of that was applied or created somewhere else, and just reflecting on what it would mean to try to apply it to your own reality, just that reflection probably will help you learn a lot and engage in action that will become meaningful.
Yes. Yeah. Great. Yeah. No, there's no shortage of projects and ideas and people trying new things. I'll tell you, in the midst of the horror and the death and the absolute unbelievability of what has happened, there is also a great amount of creativity that has been released. And this creativity, it didn't just happen overnight, right? It's been building. It's been building for so many years. And now it's like there are forums, there are places, there are Zoom webinars, where people can talk about these things and plan together. Geography is no longer a limitation. Now, I say that understanding that there are still large parts of communities that have issues with connectivity and are not participating in all of this because they're unable to due to lack of connectivity or lack of devices. That needs to change. That needs to change yesterday.
Absolutely. And so another question that came was, since you have traveled and actually studied communities around the world, how were those communities in India, for instance, different from the US? What were the differences that you see, obviously culturally, but others that you think are helpful to understand what we can learn from each other in this world, in this connected world?
One thing I learned is that we have more in common than we think. And when I've worked with communities in different places, different countries, it really does come down to the same things. You know, we want to live well. We want to live sustainably. We want to have well-being. We don't need to get rich. We don't need to have excess things and excess money. We just want to have a good life, whatever that means in the particular context. So there's more commonality than there is difference. Obviously, in different parts of the world, there are differences in the ways that people live, the housing that they have, the work that they do, the predominant religions in society, that kind of thing. Once you get past all those, though, there's really a lot of commonality. There's also a lot of difference in resources. But, you know, I'm thinking about this right now. So in the communities that I have worked in North India, there were a lot of there was a lot of limitation of material means to have a good life and to live reasonably. But when I think about a country like the US or Canada, and I think about the indigenous reserves, right? It's the same there. We cannot say that inside of a country like this, that these disparities do not exist, because they do. And in some cases, on some of the very, very impoverished reserves and very poor neighborhoods in countries like the US and Canada, the poverty there is in some cases worse than a lot of countries such as India and Kenya and other developing countries. It isn't helpful to make comparisons, really. And so I try not to do that. But, you know, I've had people who've come to visit me from various places around the world, and you know, they'll go to a particularly impoverished part of the US and they'll say, how could this exist here?
And actually, maybe a good wrapping a question then would become, what is the role of spirituality in changing or moving towards this mutualism or altruism and promoting this change in society and in ourselves? Where do you see, what should spirituality look like in order to affect this change?
Yeah, so for me, it's foundational. It's the thing that motivates my work and my commitment to working for community change. And even before I became a Baha'i, I would say that it was the motivator, but I didn't know it. I didn't realize it even then. Now I can put words to it. I can put language to it. I can employ concepts from the writings to it. For people who do recognize their spirituality, but who don't adhere to organized religion, I think it's more of a conceptual. You feel it, you just know it. It's just a thing you kind of know, and so it's the thing that comes to call on you when there's trouble and when you don't know what to do next. And I can tell you that there have been times in my work when I really didn't know what to do next. And, you know, my favorite prayer, "O Lord, unto thee I repair for refuge, and toward all thy signs I set my heart." Works every time.
Works every time.
Works every time. After I say that prayer, I know what to do.
Beautiful. And so maybe in conclusion, the last question is, how do we get from this me to the we that you were discussing, and how do we do that at a community level? How can we encourage the community we live in to move towards a shared we? Maybe you have 2 or 3 ideas that come to mind.
I think it's going to happen with or without us in time. What our role is to accelerate the process as much as we can. We know that eventually the world will know peace. And in order to know peace, we have to know unity. How we get there, though, that's a different thing. That's up to us. And so our job is to accelerate movement toward that greater peace. I don't know that I can answer in general terms how to do it, because it's very specific to a person's capacity and ability in the community, what resources they have, who they know. Start talking, start using the language that describes this we and us and ours. Use that language. That's a good start. People will say, well, what do you mean? What do you mean this is ours? How can it be ours? It's mine. No. No. And so using that mutualistic language, telling people about examples of mutualism that you have observed or that you know about, and saying to them, this looks really cool. We ought to try something like this. What do you think about this? Engaging in discourse and dialogue with people.
Yeah, definitely. I don't see a way around having the conversations to really start the action to get started.
The conversations are the first part, but don't get stuck in the conversations. Right? It's important not to get stuck there. That's a mistake that a lot of times we make, because we're kind of tentative about moving forward and taking a step. You know what? We don't have time for that now.
So we should start with words, but then move to deeds, right?
Words to deeds. Let deeds, not words, be your adorning. Absolutely.
Great. Jean, thank you so much for sharing with us what you've learned, what you're thinking about, and sharing with us clues of what our next steps might be individually or as collectives. This has been a very enriching conversation. I'd like to thank also the Wilmette Institute for hosting the webinar, and of course, Ethical Business Building the Future, EBBF, for participating in organizing this series of webinars. The recording of this webinar will be available both on Facebook and on the Wilmette Institute's YouTube channel, so you can go back to them and benefit from Jean's wisdom as many times as you'd like. And thanks everyone for participating with your questions and hopefully the learning that comes out of it.
Thank you very much.